This program is made possible in part by the National Endowment for the Arts.
Basically, how it happened. Then I had my first book out and about.
Hello, welcome to The Writing Life. I'm Jean Nordhaus, and I'm talking with the wonderful Irish poet Mary O'Malley. Mary is from the Irish-speaking west coast of Ireland and lives in Moycullen, Gaeltracht, outside of Galway. And she's one of the best-known women poets working today in Ireland. And last year was featured in Yvonne Boland's Three Irish Poets, which was published by Carcanet, which is one of the very prestigious British poetry publishing houses. And they also published the most recent of her 5 collections, The Boning Hall. Mary, I thought we should start by hearing you just reading one of your poems, and pick a poem for us that you feel is particularly significant and important for your work.
Thank you, Jean. I think, as we've mentioned The Boning Hall, I will start with a poem which really speaks somewhat to Adrian Rich in Diving into the Wreck. The Boning Hall. No one goes diving into coffin ships, but if they did, with the desire for pearls quelled, they'd see wonders. Limbs streaming by, the rush of blood, oxygen, water bubbling with the slipstream. Then the flesh stripped to the bones, flensed, and the master saying, measure twice, cut once, the same for a steel boat as a set of pipes. Bone pipes. A phosphorescent shape, not fish, not seal woman, but essence slips through the eye of a needle, of a storm. Past the fabulous galleons, the gold coin down to where black water is, and the little open-mouthed bone harp sings, not of the names for things you cannot say, but the long, round call of the thing itself.
That's a lovely poem.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about the origin of the poem, or how you came to write that?
It was, in a way, because I have written a lot out of mythology, and because I have written of the whole mythos of the sea from which I came. This was a poem moving out of that and into the purity of language in a way.
Yes, yes, you can really hear that.
And there's an echo of Walcott as well, Derek Walcott, the Caribbean poet, Os, the bone, where he takes the language right down to the bone. But also, very simply, the title is taken from a song by a singer called Christy Moore.
Ah.
And I heard him sing it in Paris once in a very large venue called La Villette, which he said had been an abattoir. And there is something in writing, I'm afraid, where at a certain stage or age, you're flensed, you're brought right down to the bone.
That's fascinating. There are always, I think, in reading poems, particularly poems that come so densely out of their own culture as yours do, so many allusions that we miss, and yet the basic music of the poem and the basic feeling of the poem comes through, even if the allusions are sometimes mysterious.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's one of the mistakes often made in teaching poetry, actually, that children have to know the meaning, or indeed adults, of the absolute meaning of a poem on every level, which is clearly impossible, before they understand it. They don't. We receive poems often first on the level of sound, which of course, Whitman knew. And Randall Gerald said a lovely thing. He said, poems do not need to be understood, they need to be loved.
That is wonderful. According to the article that appeared in the Sun paper this week, you grew up as one of 10 children of a fisherman in Connemara. Can you tell us how, from that background, you came to poetry, and how that background has influenced your work?
Yes, it was very hard to raise them. I'm the eldest of 10. And
you were the oldest.
I came to poetry very early, I think, through Irish poetry in Irish, not in English. I was raised, as I always think a lot of Americans have been and probably still are being raised, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and in the past, obviously, Irish Americans, where you're first generation into a language, a very overwhelming language. But there's a part of you, and I've read Hispanic American, I read Spanish American poetry a lot, and I've read people talking, Chinese Americans talking about this, where you have a life in the everyday language, as I have in English, but there's a whole other existence and past and culture which exists in the other language, which you yourself may know only imperfectly. Mm-hmm. But your bones know it.
That
you know, your ear knows it.
Yeah.
And most of all, there are certain things which will not click into any other language. Certain meanings, certain expressions, certain feelings. In my case, I am from an area where we had never written about ourselves in English. But because the area is very beautiful and supposed to be fairly savage, we had been written about a lot in English. We had only written about ourselves in Irish, so I only ever saw us represented accurately in the Irish language.
That's very... And what was different between the English representation and the Irish
The English representation was from the outside. Mm-hmm. And so I was trying to write, I had a need to write out of, in this language, to do something with this language, which I loved. I mean, obviously I read the English poets, of course, in English, but my desire to write, the permission to write did not come from English, it came from Irish.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah. But then you see you're landed with an inarticulation in your own language, which is a very dangerous thing. Mm-hmm. John Montague writes about that, the poet John Montague, who was born in Brooklyn and reared in the north of Ireland. And as to coming to poetry, in Ireland poetry isn't seen to exist only in the academy or only for people in the university. Mm-hmm. So actually poetry and song are very close together, and story. And so I came from the stories of I mean, I've heard Louise Erdrich talk, for example, about this, coming from the stories of the tribe, effectively, to be frank, and also from song, from music.
Yes. Yeah. Could you read us a few, something that comes out of the...
perhaps I will read a story out of the mythology, a poem, I should say, but it's a story out of the mythology, and it's called The Wound, and it makes reference to something called a currach, which is just a little canvas boat that they use for fishing on the west coast of Ireland. And it's really about men and women as well. The Wound. Nothing changes. The legend tells of 3 men in a currach fishing. A big sea rose up and threatened to engulf them. They cast lots to see who was wanted, a young man. As the swell hung over him, he grabbed a knife and pitched in desperation, cold steel against the wave. The sea withdrew and all were saved. One man heard a cry of pain and prayed. At nightfall, a woman on a white horse inquired and found the house. My mistress is sick, and only you can save her, she said, and gave him guarantees. They took the road under the sea to a palace where a beautiful woman lay. His knife was buried in her right breast. This is the knife you cast into my flesh. You must pull it out with a single stroke, or I will die by midnight. He did, and the wound became a rose. She offered the treasures of her green underworld, a pagan kiss, the same old story. She begged, this scar will ache forever if you go. Then a choir of lost men whispered, stay here, and she will have your soul. So he blessed himself, refused, and went above to the simple, solid world he understood.
That's lovely.
So.
Although you don't write yourself in Irish, you've translated and worked with Irish language poets, I know, and several of your poems address the experience of living between languages. And I was thinking about Paul Celan, who, and what it must be like, who wrote in German, the language of the people who had destroyed his own people. and what it is like to be writing in a language that you distrust and have to remake in some way.
Yeah. I mean, I love English, obviously, and I've written very directly about that in my second book, but about carding the language like wool, you know, taking it. I use the image of taking sheep's wool and carding it and making it into something of our own, because the so-called Hiberno English, or indeed American English as well, compared with, say, British Standard English, is very different. That's how a language lives. A language lives when it's remade and when the rules are broken as well as kept, I think. And we take words into it, borrowings and so on. There is a conflict. There's an internal tension, which in a way a lot of poetry requires and thrives on that odd tension, I think.
I think Donald Hall has said that if a poem doesn't include paradox, it's not a poem.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. But Celan is a particularly interesting case because some of the poems in this book would have been in some level influenced by Celan, where he just pared the language down to the images of incredible suffering and disintegration.
Yes.
At the end, particularly, but brilliance, you know, absolute brilliance. I think for me it's an act of repossession as well, and I take Irish words in and I leave them there. You know?
Yes.
It is a necessary repossession of a language that was originally imposed.
Can you read a little from one of those poems? One of the poems that you were describing?
Yes.
Either that or The Shape of Saying, which is...
Perhaps The Shape of Saying, if I can find it, which is a poem about that. It's taken, you know, from the Welsh poet Dylan Thomas's... part of the title is taken from him. But it's about the notion that words have a shape. And yes, I'll read just a couple of stanzas from The Shape of Saying. They call it received English, as if it was a gift you got by dint of primogeniture. Maybe it was. Old gold words toned like concert violins, tuned to talk to God. After the French and Latin wars, I relished the poppies of dawn, though I thought this graceful foreign tongue was only meant for men, all right for the likes of Coleridge, but it gave me unpleasant dreams. They say we cannot speak it, and they're right. It was hard and slippery as pebbles, full of cornered consonants and pinched vowels, until we took it by the neck and shook it. We sheared it, carded it, fleeced it, and finally wove it into something of our own, fit for curses and blessings, for sweet talk and spite, and the sounds of hearts rending, the sound of hearts tearing.
That's wonderful. I love the concreteness with which the language becomes a physical thing in that work. I know that you've done a lot of work with radio in Ireland, and that you frequently perform with musicians, and music permeates your poetry, it seems to me. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your relationship to music.
I would think, you know, from the Orphic voice on, that poetry and music are just almost inextricably linked. They do exist, of course, separately as well. But the lyric voice, by its nature, is a voice of music. And I've often thought that, or I have recently thought, that as a poet and as a writer, I exist somewhere on that continuum between what Derek Mahan calls the dazzling dark, that darkness out of which we come, and what Sylvia Plath calls the cold planetary light of the mind. That it's at any given time you're somewhere on that trajectory. And music, I suppose, I love it, but it infinitely interests me because it was the language we had when we had nothing else, where I come from. We had singing and we had music, and it was, technically it was very interesting, because into those slow and fast tunes, or the very formal, mask-like, very Greek Irish sean-nós singing, which very, very formal, unemotional on the surface, we packed all of that emotional and spiritual, perhaps, experience, and all of the loss as well. And that became, you know, within that tight technical control, in a way, this enormously powerful expression came out, but often without words, or the words were secondary. And so I love to work with musicians, and I find that we work very well together.
You've written a whole series of poems about the Irish Sean singer
Joe Heaney.
Joe Heaney.
For a television documentary, actually. I was asked by the producer to use poetry as linkage rather than voiceover for the documentary between the interviews. Yes, he was from Connemara, and he ended up teaching singing in the University of Washington at Seattle, where he eventually died in New York and was taken home and buried. So many where I come from live half their lives in America.
Do they?
Or their imaginary lives in America, because that's where
their imaginary lives.
Well, because their relations were there. You know, very often. We had a strange, I often think that's where the real Atlantis was, on the airplane or the boat between America and the west of Ireland. You know.
Yes, whole reams could be written about the complex relationship between the two countries.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, I know that living abroad a good bit of the time is quite a venerable tradition in Irish writing. I'm thinking of James Joyce and Samuel Beckett, who spent most of their writing life outside of Ireland. And I know that you spent 8 years living in Lisbon and that you've traveled quite a lot. And I wonder if the absences help you to see your own country better.
Perspective. I think with distance. Probably everybody doesn't need it. John McGahern rather wonderfully said he found that you could write as badly in or out of Ireland. As well as, and of course he's right. No, it's very important for me. And also I think we are an island, and important as that is, with that the negative of that is insularity. And it's important to touch further afield.
Well, some writers are like Antaeus, and they can only write when they have their feet on their native ground. And for others...
Yeah, I mostly write there, but I bring an awful lot back with me. I like to think.
Why don't you read us another poem? Could I ask you for The Man of Aran, unless you want to save that for the end?
I should say that The Man of Aran is written about a film, a very famous film called by Robert O'Flaherty, who was obviously Irish-American, but American-born, who came back to Ireland in about, I think, 1912. I'm notoriously bad on dates, but the very early days of film. It was a silent movie, marvellous camera work. The problem was he nearly killed half the islanders making it, because in order to make it dramatic, he had them do things they would never normally do. And I suppose the poem is really also about the fact that artists are sometimes very careless of the people they use for their art. And the notion of taking a peasant community, which is of course what we were really, and making an epic. Well, you know, the Greek epic was nothing but, I mean, it was this small local war, really, which became, all our local wars are epics.
Yes.
The Man of Aran. But what if it were not epic? Before the echo sounder was invented, fishermen let down weighted piano wire. They listened for a school to hit, a note to sound. Perhaps a scale, grace notes, as single fish hit E-flat minor, say, or strange tunes as a shoal crescendo through the water, minnows and sharks, sharps and flats, heard from above at a different pitch, not perfect, but accurate, close enough for jazz. Their watery playing gave them up to slaughter, but the boatman dreamed of women singing, and the song coaxed him as he lured mackerel with feathers that darted like blue jays through the clear sea. He stayed out too long. Let's leave it at that. There would be cliffs rearing soon enough, weather fighting. No need for all that hauling of wrack to the wrong side of the island, for drowning the locals, for shark. We know how it works. A pretty lure, hunger, the hook. No storm is as sweet or deadly as the sting. The barbs sink.
The image of the fish going through the wires and making music is something that I think I will treasure for the rest of my life.
It's true.
Wonderful.
My father told me about it.
Oh, wonderful.
It's actually a very, very real image.
Yes. How has your family responded to your life as a poet? Has that...
Mostly, it's not a fit subject for conversation.
I see. Oh dear.
Except for my brothers, two of my brothers,
Yeah.
and my father approved. Yeah, but
Well, I noticed that you had your epigraph by Adrienne Rich in the Boning Hall, and Adrienne Rich is a poet who has enormous influence on a whole generation of women writers in the United States. I know her Diving into the Wreck was just a seminal work for me, and and throughout the world, really.
Yes.
And I wondered if you could talk about sort of feminism and what it means in the context of Irish poetry and of your own work in particular. I know Yvonne Boland has said that it was easier in Ireland traditionally to write about a political murder than about a washing machine, but
Oh, yes.
I noticed there aren't very many washing machines in your poetry,
No.
and that you have no problem writing to protest violence and
No.
injustice. So the political belongs to you
I
as
would
well.
say the great question, I never describe myself as a woman poet, but I would say that the great question for writers is that you be allowed to choose your own subject matter. And of course I have written about the domestic. Not as much as a lot of women have, but simply because I have other things of major concern. But it is there, it's very much there. And I think the problem, there is still a problem when we say woman writer and not man writer, of course.
Yes.
We're all aware
Well, I
of
was thinking
that.
we say woman writer, but male writer. We don't say man writer, we say male
say
writer.
male.
But we don't say
Yeah.
female writer, we say
No, we
woman
don't.
writer.
It's a strange
been pondering
grammatical
that.
thing.
Yeah.
But also the adjective tends to be diminishing, frankly, not
Yes.
deliberately. There was Yvonne Boland probably single-handedly in Ireland did an enormous amount of work to redress that balance. I would say that I remember her sending me a book of letters between Elizabeth Bishop and Robert Lowell, as an example of a truly equal relationship, because their gender really, in a way, not that it didn't come into it, but he treated her absolutely in those letters as a writer of equal status. And I suppose for me that's the ideal. I have to say I never once doubted that I could become a writer because I was a woman, and that I think was probably more an accident of history.
Of identity and history.
Yes.
Yes.
And it has been said that my poetry is very territorial for a woman.
We won't go further into that.
But it's a live
Yes.
issue, I think the real issue of women's writing at the moment is probably in the critical realm. We haven't, I remember Paula Meehan once saying to me, it's very often that women's attention is focused on different things, and I think that's very true. Very often there can be a difference in that women can be interested in different areas of subject matter and material, rather than that they're not interested in the so-called bigger subjects or that they're not able to deal with them. They simply may see other things as the bigger subjects.
Or come into them from a different angle.
Yes, that may be the case.
Our time is growing short, so I'm hoping that you could talk a little bit about what you're working on now and where do you think your work will be going, and then maybe read us a few more poems.
Well, I'm supposed to be now working on a play. I suppose I have always known that I was involved with theatre a long time ago. I would try and write a couple of plays, so I'm trying to write a play.
Will they be in verse? The plays? Will your play be in verse?
No, not this one, no. The other thing I'm writing is a memoir of my childhood, particularly of the place, and that is being written. I have a couple of pieces of it published. But also I think I'm changing direction. I have been reading Solane, I've been reading a lot of the Latin poets. I'm having perhaps writing with less and less narrative in my work. Though you mightn't consider my work very narrative, it would be from a certain angle.
Oh, I would say it's
pretty narrative.
Much of it is quite narrative.
Yes.
Yeah.
Within the Irish tradition it wouldn't be very narrative, but I think I'm becoming less and less so. And I'll read a poem called "My Role Was That of an Observer," which is about Bloody Sunday and the last witness in the tribunal on the shooting in Derry into an innocent crowd of civilians on Bloody Sunday 30 years ago has just given his testimony, so perhaps I'll read this. The average age of the boys who were killed was 17. And my role was that of an observer, was what General Robert Ford, who was in command of the army at the time, said. Your blue eyes, Danny boy, your black hair. They were all armed, the men, marching, and that shape there is a gun, very like a gun. No, more like a nail bomb, forsooth. Yes, Your Honour, very like a nail bomb. More like a widget, methinks, my lord. Yes, very like a widget, so we shot it. Widgety Lord Widgery. 13 widgets, weapon carriers, every 17-year-old Fenian one of them, sir. It was a Sunday. There was snow. 30 years ago. 17. The age to love. The year to die. Your dark hair, Danny boy. Your blue terrorist eyes.
It's wonderful. And the last line is a particularly loaded line for us these days.
Yes, of course it is, yes. We have to be careful not to catch the wrong people.
Right.
I think.
I can really hear the playwright in that, in the dialogue in that poem particularly.
Well, actually, it comes from Shakespeare, of course. It's a take on Shakespeare, or at least,
Right.
Yeah.
I think we have time for another short poem.
Okay. Perhaps I will read, as they say, something completely different. I have a little poem about Billie Holiday.
Oh, lovely.
And as you
Perfect.
said, I write about music a lot, and this is just called Billie because I always loved her, and I was always interested in the way the men loved her because there was so much pain in her voice. Men just loved Billie. Her unblaming pain made them want to hurt her more, just to hear that voice soar and dip, the little rasp, silk on a nail file, as it slid up from her belly.
Thank you, Mary, for joining us today and for sharing your wonderful work with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And thank you for joining us on The Writing Life.